Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you for joining me for another presentation. This time looking at the situation with Dr. Fauci and the congressional hearings that occurred just a few days ago. I'm just giving you some thoughts. I'll be sharing a video from Simon Tabor, which was on LinkedIn, where they had a clip. And I'll just be giving it some ideas and some thoughts about what really I think is important to come out of this discussion. Before we start, I want to encourage you to remember to click the subscribe button. It will be in the bottom right corner here on YouTube. Otherwise, on what other platform you are, please join us on this journey. And if you look in the description below, there will be some links to important courses or Vejon Chatbot, and we look forward to you being part of this journey of research. But let's get back to this question. What was the purpose of the congressional hearing with Dr. Fauci? For many people, they think that it was an opportunity to criticize him and to highlight the errors that he has made. And yes, there have been some, and that will happen with any scientist. However, there's a far more serious question that needs to come out with regards to the question of the lab leak. And so what I'll do is I'll share with you this short clip. I'll pause it along the way just so that you have an idea as to what I'm thinking about when I look at the seriousness of what we're facing from a clinical and a scientific point of view. So let's get into the information. So let's hear what Mr. Jordan said, and then Dr. Joyce said afterwards when they were asking questions of Dr. Fauci. Important to note, they only have 5 minutes, so it's not really an interrogation. It's just an opportunity to give a few sound bites. Let's hear how it started.
Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Time's expired. Now recognize Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, why was it so important that the virus not have started in a lab?
I'll just pause you there a minute. This is an important point. And what people forget was that in 2020, it was the first thought across the world because of the proximity to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the characteristics about what appeared to be in the virus that most scientists thought, obviously, yeah, this was a lab leak. However, there was a strong pushback from the scientific community, for which Dr. Fauci was a part, which came out with a paper at that time with about 50 leading scientists across the world saying, no, this is natural. And so that was the template that then became a question of misinformation if anyone spoke about it being a lab leak. That was where we were at that time in middle 2020. Let's get back to what he had to say.
We don't know where it started, and that's the reason why I keep an open mind. So I don't know what you mean by why was it so important. It wasn't important.
You still don't know where it started? The guys you gave money to figured it out in 3 days.
No.
Mr. Anderson said on January 31st, 2020, virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. The very next day, Dr. Gary said, I don't know how this happens in nature. It'd be easy to do in a lab. And then 3 days later, Shazam, they switch and say it has to be nature. So they figured it out in 3 days, but you still don't know?
No, in fact, if you look at what they were saying, Congressman Jordan, they were saying that it was not a manufactured virus. It still could have evolved out of a lab.
Well, let me read something here to you.
They're not incompatible.
In our study on the censorship of the Biden administration working with big tech, I want to read you a WhatsApp message from Mark Zuckerberg. Can we include that the White House put pressure on us to censor the lab leak theory? So this is a communication on July 16th, 2021. Nick Clegg, Joel Kaplan, Sheryl Sandberg, Mark Zuckerberg. They're certainly feeling the pressure to downplay any lab leak.
You have to pause this here. This is really, really important because at that time there was pressure from the administration that anybody who speaks about the lab leak should be blocked from misinformation. So many people who continue to raise this question found that they were censored. And you have to understand that the lab leak theory technically disappeared almost up to a year after it had been questioned, until largely one person just wouldn't stop looking. This guy, I think he was from India, kept on digging through all the papers. And what he found was there was pretty good evidence that there was a similarly formed virus that was being used or was being researched at that time in that lab. That's what caused it to come back to the forefront. So in theory, it almost completely disappeared. The question still remains, what skin in the game do they have as to why they would encourage this kind of cover up? Because that's really all you can think that it is. Let's go on and hear what else he has to say.
Is there a question there?
There's coming. One's coming. Here's another email to Mark Zuckerberg. It says, subject line, COVID misinformation, Wuhan lab leak theory. In response to continued public pressure and tense conversations with the new administration, we started removing 5 COVID claims, including the lab leak theory. Mr. Zuckerberg responds, this seems like a good reminder that when we compromise our standards due to pressure from an administration in either direction, we often later regret it. Why was it so important the virus not have started in a lab?
Wasn't so important that the virus not. We don't know. We know
it was important to someone in the Biden administration, so much so that the top people at Meta, the top people at Facebook are asking, why are we getting all this pressure to downplay the lab leak theory? And we have an email from June of the same year, June 4th, 2021, saying the same thing. It was certainly important to somebody.
Well, what has that got to do with me?
Pause there a second. So I think that what is happening there is that there clearly was pressure from the government, but you can see that from Anthony Fauci's perspective, what he is saying is that you have no evidence that that pressure was coming from him. Now, I think that it's problematic when we look back at 2020, because he was one of the strongest vocal people at the time that discounted the lab leak theory. And I keep on explaining to people is that I understand that somebody wouldn't want to be involved in the question about a lab leak. That's quite understandable in the sense that if you were part of the process with regards to the lab leak development or the unusual virus, nobody would want to be participant in that. But from a clinical point of view, we need to know that, because if it was a lab leak, it is quite likely that there are characteristics about this virus that are not normal. And so when people would say things like all viruses shift into endemicity, meaning that they get milder and milder and they just disappear, that may not hold true if this virus was engineered in a lab. That's why I'm focused on it, because if the clinical and the scientific community don't grasp that point, they will continue to assume this is just a normal virus. Let's get back to what else was being said.
I'm asking you because you're the expert on the coronavirus. I'm saying, why was the administration so pushing not to have the lab leak theory as something that was viable?
I can answer that. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
You kept an open mind, Dr. Fauci, open mind.
That is correct.
What happened in those 3 days? Why did Dr. Anderson and Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, why did they change their mind in 180 degrees? Because what Christian Anderson says 3 days later, after he said virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory, 3 days later he says the main crackpot theories going around at the moment relate to this virus being somehow engineered, and that is demonstrably false. How did they figure all that out in 3 days, Dr. Fauci?
You can do that.
Still have an open mind.
Well, what they did is that they testified before this committee. What they did, they went back and looked at the sequences and realized that their initial concern was unfounded about that, and it did not look at all like it was manufactured. But as they said in their paper, even though they feel it was more likely,
3 days they figured
that's
it out.
Exactly. You could do that in 3 days. You can scan sequences in a day. You don't need 3 days.
Again, I will pause you here. And the reality is that I've been lucky to be at the cutting edge and listening to scientific input from people who have been doing some really detailed research from different parts of the world. One of the professors that I interviewed, and he highlighted that when he was doing what were blast sequences, looking at characteristics of the spike protein that were similar to other proteins, spike proteins in nature, he stumbled across a sequence in the spike protein, what we call the furin cleavage site, which really is critical to making the virus so infective, at least the earlier variants. And that this was not normally in a human coronavirus. It was in some other bat coronaviruses, but not in a human coronavirus. What stood out to him was that when he did the careful analysis of this furin cleavage site, he found that there was a patent on it. Now that they realized when they published that paper as a consortium, that was a 1 in a trillion chance that that could have occurred naturally. So when you're adding it all up and you're looking at the characteristics, you're realizing more and more this is pointing to a lab leak. Why was this not at the top of the agenda from all scientists all across the world? Let's listen to a bit more.
Okay, who's Robert Redfield?
The former director of the CDC.
Dr. Redfield, right? And he was also on the coronavirus task force. Is that accurate?
He was a member of the coronavirus task force.
And here's what he said to this committee. He said, Redfield said that Fauci and Collins left him out because Redfield suspected that coronavirus had leaked from the Chinese lab. Is that accurate?
Well, he said that, but that's not true.
You're
That
saying
is incorrect, Congressman.
Dr. Redfield's lying to the committee
No.
when he sat right where you sat?
When he said that I kept him out, that is an incorrect statement. The roster who was on the phone
was Dr. Redfield in that conference call on February 1st when you had Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary on that call?
He was not. And the conference call was put together by Jeremy Farrar. So no one kept him out. He said he was kept out because
Did
he felt.
Did U.S. tax dollars?
You want me to answer the question?
Yeah, I would just wonder why he wasn't on the call. It seems to me the head of CDC, part of the coronavirus task force, which was formed 2 days prior to that call, would have been on the call.
I'm just pausing you here. One of the things that has been really strange about this whole investigation, and there were previous interviews with Dr. Fauci about various comments that were made. And one of the things that he kept on saying is he can't quite remember what was said and who he met. But yet, in that sequence, he remembers in detail who were in the meetings in early 2020. That's quite remarkable. And it highlights that for some reason, this was extremely important to him. Whichever way we take it, there is really, really poor science and investigation of science that occurred around the pandemic. Let's listen to a little bit more as they continue with this exchange.
Well, the call was arranged by Jeremy Farrar. You should ask him.
Okay. Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
I'm sorry. What was?
Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
Yes, of course. It was a subaward to the Wuhan Institute.
And who approved that award?
Excuse me?
And who approved that award? What agency approved that award?
National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
You know, when people hesitate when they're asking a question, when they go, excuse me, they're giving themselves time usually to make sure that the answer is consistent. Because that was quite a simple question. Of course, he was head of the NIH, and of course, he was involved in the approval of that bit of information. Why the hesitation?
Your agency approved that, right?
Yes, it did.
Did that have anything to do with this downplaying of the lab leak theory?
No.
Nothing to do with it.
Nothing.
What do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got.
Yeah, I think most of the country would find that amazing. When we look back at what had happened, And we realize that in reality, so many things could have been different about the pandemic. Because fundamentally, whether people want to accept this or not, just think about it logically. The spike protein, if, let's give it a benefit of the doubt, if it was engineered in a lab and it was adjusted to become more infective, were there any other characteristics that could have been put in this spike protein? Now, here is the really big question. This is the elephant in the room. And for people who don't quite understand the elephant in the room, that same spike protein was replicated and used to try and prevent infection. Just reflect on that a minute. If the spike protein was engineered in a lab and then you replicate it, what could be the potential health implications if this spike protein has capabilities beyond that of a normal virus? That is the clinical and the scientific question that really needs to be asked. That is the elephant in the room. That is the one that nobody really wants to tackle because the implications around it are so horrendous. I can understand the general public being concerned about this. I can understand that politicians don't want to talk about this. But scientists, clinicians, your role and your responsibility is advocacy, advocating for patients, advocating for health. Our role can't be to defend those who need to be investigated. We don't need to pass judgment. We just need to get answers. Answers that will hopefully protect people in the long run. Have a great evening.